My name is Toby Lawrence. I'm the president of Lawrence Advisory Services, and I'll be talking about our firm's merger and acquisition services. In my 30-year plus career, I've been involved in over 45 merger and acquisition transactions. Everything from helping sellers to buyers to helping credit unions find a merger candidate. The very first thing I like to do on the buy side is create a merger and acquisition strategic plan. I think it's important to add discipline to the process. Too many people that are going out there to do a buy just go in there willy-nilly and don't end up with the transaction they want. So one of the things I like to do is sit down with the shareholders, the board of directors, and senior management and put together a defined plan to go after an acquisition. In this strategic plan, we ask everything from what size of transaction do we want? How are we going to finance it? Is it a troubled bank or is it a bank that's already operating well? One of the most important questions is, do we have good management in place? Or are we going to transfer somebody from our existing locations? So there's a lot of questions that need to be asked before you proceed and start actually contacting buyers. Speaking of which, one of the most important thing is who's going to be involved in terms of our experts. What attorney is going to be involved? Are we going to use an outside party to contact prospective buyers? And in that, I always recommend that you do. It shows, one, that you're serious, and two, helps take the emotions out of the process. The next step is where I start contacting prospective candidates. I typically will have an agreed upon script, so to speak, with the buyer. Here's what we're willing to say and what we're not willing to say. And I'll just proceed through the list from most desirable to the least desirable until I get at least 2 or 3 potential candidates that might be interested. For those 2 or 3 that might be interested, I'll go on and have a face-to-face meeting and try to fill them out a little bit more in terms of their interest, what they're looking for purchase price, any other terms that they may want in terms of maybe keeping certain employees or non-compete agreements or whatever. From there, we'll put together a letter of intent, which of course I'm always going to recommend that they have their attorney look at before we give it to the seller. After that, the next step is the due diligence. Now, I'll actually put together the due diligence checklist for the client and go on site with them to perform that, just to make sure it moves smoothly and that they've done everything that they should be doing to do a proper due diligence. Once due diligence is completed, the next step is the drafting of the definitive agreement or the purchase and assumption agreement. That's always a process where there's a lot of ongoing negotiation, and I'm heavily involved in that, both advising the buyer's attorney as well as talking to the seller's attorney. Once we finally get to what we consider a good agreement that both parties can sign, the definitive agreement is signed and executed by both parties. The next step is the regulatory application. Most clients will actually have me complete that. I've probably done 60 to 70 of those and have a very good idea what the regulators are looking for. That includes everything from drafting the projected financial statements, calculating future capital ratios, describing the benefits to the community, and other things that are required in the regulatory application. The regulatory application will take anywhere from 60 to 75 days to get the regulatory approval. Once we have that, the next step is to actually close the transaction. And I'll typically show up at closing just to make sure that everything proceeds the way it should be and it goes smoothly for both parties. On the sell side, I think it's important that I listen to the client and understand what they're looking for in terms of a sales price, as well as any terms or other conditions that they want. For example, do they have a certain employee that they want to take care of? I will also look at 5 years worth of call reports for the client and provide them with data on recent transactions, just to make sure that what they're expecting in terms of a purchase price is reasonable. Next, I do something I consider extremely unique. In fact, to my knowledge, I'm the only one that does this. I actually would do a due diligence review on the seller's operations. The reason I do this is I want to uncover any type of issues that a prospective buyer may discover during their due diligence. That tells me, do we need to clean up the bank before we sell it? Or do I need to at least disclose those items in the memorandum of understanding? Gaining buyers' trust is very critical to the process and helping the clients get the price that they want to get. I then draft a memorandum of understanding. In that memorandum of understanding, I have both financial information on the operation being sold, as well as qualitative information. For example, the asset quality of the loan portfolio, the average yields and maturity of investment securities, information on the payroll and pay structure of key officers. Once that is done, I will start to contact prospective buyers. Before I do contact a buyer, I always like to look at their call report and make sure they have the capital and the means to actually complete the transaction. In the memorandum of understanding, we will also specify the content of the letter of intent that the buyers have to submit. We'll ask them for everything from their purchase price, an example of their calculation, as well as a sample of their reps and warranties that they're going to ask for. We then will look at the letters of intent that are submitted by prospective buyers and work with the seller to pick which one we think is the best deal for the seller. And on this, we look at, most importantly, the net after-tax proceeds. So it's important to understand the structure that the seller or the buyer is proposing, and look at and calculate what is going to be the net proceeds to the seller. Another thing I like to do is to review the regulatory application that is prepared by the buyer. The reason being is I've done so many of these transactions in my career that I can help highlight things or make suggestions to them to help make the application process go smoother, which is in the interest of both parties to get the deals done as quickly as possible and as smoothly as possible. The last thing I like to do is show up at the closing and just make sure, again, the transaction and the closing proceeds smoothly. First, be realistic on the price, whether you're a seller or the buyer, in terms of what you want for your deal, your bank, or what you're willing to pay. Be realistic. 2, be disciplined. Have a defined process. 3, allow the professionals you hire to do their job. One of the worst things that can happen is when a buyer or a seller tries to contact the other side directly. They tend to get their emotions involved and deals fall apart. If you are a buyer, do thorough due diligence. Most buyers tend to focus on asset quality issues and then turn around and miss key provisions of significant vendor contracts or asset liability issues, or even the loss of key employees. If a bank loses a key employee soon, either before the transaction closes or soon thereafter, they typically take customers with them. So that's an important thing to cover during the due diligence. Also, I think it's important that the buyer and the seller work together to craft the messages. There's a message that needs to go out to both customers as well as employees. Now, in terms of customers, I suggest that the buyer and seller go out and meet with the top customers before the deal becomes public. That's going to help retain those customers, which is what you're really buying when you buy the bank. It's important that you be honest with your employees. Something is going to change, and so establishing that trust is going to help you retain those, which is crucial to making the deal successful. Another thing is, for sellers, focus on after-tax proceeds. Too many sellers get wrapped up in multiples. That's great for bragging to your buddies in terms of what price I got, but it's not going to put cash in your pocket. Lastly, sign key employees to non-compete, non-solicitation agreements. I can't stress this enough. Too many banks think that, customers do business with the bank. That's not true. Customers do business with people they like. So getting those key employees signed to agreements is going to help retain the value that you're purchasing. It's important for the buyer as well. And the reason being is, if key employees leave, they typically take their top customers with them. And really what you're buying is the customer list, the future revenues that come from that list. The last thing I'd probably say is, for sellers, is to know the reputation of prospective buyers. For example, I knew at one bank that every time they bid on a deal, they would always bid high, and then after due diligence, change their price by 15 to 20%. But in between the letter of intent and the due diligence, they would have the loan officers out on the street telling the community that they were already bought the bank. And in effect, what they were trying to do is force the seller into selling. So knowing who the reputation of the buyers or prospective buyers, it's very important to know that so that you don't get involved in with the wrong people. If you are a buyer or a seller or a credit union looking for a merger, give me a call. I can sit down with you and explain to you how I can be of assistance to your organization. I will also explain how I structure my fees. One of the things that makes me unique is that the majority of my fees are not payable until I'm successful. I can do that because I have the expertise and the experience and over 30 years of doing deals that I can be sure I'll be both successful and therefore you'll be successful.